Welcome to Tobacco Online Policy Seminar. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Yingming Wang, Assistant Professor at the University of California, San Francisco. TOPS is organized by Justin White from University of California, San Francisco, Catherine McLean from George Mason University, Mike Pesco from Georgia State University, and Cessation from the Ohio State University. The seminar will be an hour with questions from the moderator and discussant. The audience may pose questions and comments in the Q&A panel, and the moderator will draw from these questions and comments in conversation with the presenter. Please review the guidelines on tobaccopolicy.org for acceptable comments. Please keep the comments professional and related to the research being discussed. Comments that meet the seminar series guidelines will be shared with the presenter afterwards, even if they are not read aloud. Your comments are very much appreciated. This presentation is being video recorded and will be made available along with presentation slides on the TOPS website, tobaccopolicy.org. I will turn the presentation over to today's moderator, Justin White at the University of California, San Francisco, to introduce our speaker.
Today we continue our spring 2023 season with a single paper presentation by Charles Courtemanche entitled E-Cigarettes and Smoking Cessation, Evidence from NRT Sales, Quitlines, and Surveys. This presentation was selected by a competitive review process by submission through the TOPS website. Dr. Courtemanche is an associate professor of economics in the Gatton College of Business and Economics at the University of Kentucky and director of the Institute for the Study of Free Enterprise. He's a health economist and applied microeconomist with particular research interests in the economics of obesity and nutrition, health insurance, COVID-19, and big box retailers. He's published 50 papers in a variety of journals, including the Journal of Health Economics and Health Affairs. According to research papers in economics, he's the top-ranked economist in Kentucky in terms of research productivity over the past 10 years. He's received research funding from the National Institutes of Health, United States Department of Agriculture, Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, and Food and Drug Administration. Dr. Courtemanche is also lead editor of the Southern Economic Journal, a research associate in the Health Economics Program at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a research affiliate with the Institute for the Study of Labor, IZA. Our discussant today is Cessation from The Ohio State University. Co-author Catherine McLean will respond to selected questions in the Q&A. Dr. Charles Courtemanche, thank you for presenting for us today.
Thank you, Justin, and thanks to everyone for being here. It looks like a great turnout. I'm coming to you live from a New Orleans hotel room, but it's the beauty of technology. So I will go ahead and share my slides here, and then all right. Can you all see my slides, Justin?
Looks good, yeah.
All right, thank you. So this little bit of a last minute title change here, just based on what we're actually examining. So e-cigarettes and smoking cessation, evidence from nicotine replacement therapy sales, prescription medications, and Quitlines. And this paper is co-authored with Catherine McLean and Mike Pesco, who are both much smarter than me, and I will refer all the hard questions to them. So we've got a whole pile of disclaimers here. So this is funded by the NIH and an R01, and also in part by the institute I run at UK. And I also have the Nielsen, the disclaimer at the bottom you see is the Nielsen dated disclaimer. So just to set up the broad motivation, smoking cessation attempts are common, but largely unsuccessful. So 70% of smokers report wanting to quit, 55% report attempting to quit annually, but in a given year, only 7.5% are successful. So not a very good success rate. Nicotine replacement therapies, or NRTs, aim to aid in cessation attempts by providing well, at a lower dose nicotine, and essentially trying to shift over from, to a different nicotine source that, doesn't come with all the toxicants, all the chemicals, and the most harmful parts of the most harmful aspects of combustible cigarettes. So 5 NRTs, different categories of NRTs, are approved by the FDA in the US: gum, inhalers, lozenges, nasal sprays, and patches. Of these, gum, lozenges, and patches can be purchased over the counter. And NRTs can be very successful, increase quit rates by 50 to 60%. But yet there's used in less than a third of cessation attempts. So they're, for whatever reason, they're not, fully meeting needs. They seem to be underutilized. So with that setup, e-cigarettes have emerged as another possible aid to smoking cessation attempts. So 14% of current smokers who attempted to quit smoking in the past year reported using e-cigarettes in their quit attempts, and 11% of former smokers reported using e-cigarettes in their successful quit attempts. Recent RCTs suggest that e-cigarettes can help some smokers quit, but of course their use in general and for cessation purposes specifically can be controversial, since they are not with they don't come with no harm. They are with no risks, just most likely a significantly small risk than combustible cigarettes, but there are chemicals, etc. So just to illustrate kind of the divide and the controversy, e-cigarettes strongly supported by the UK's National Health Service, but less so for the use of cessation purposes, but less so by US agencies. And in the UK, they tend to rely strongly on a report that that concludes that e-cigarettes are only about 5% as harmful as combustible cigarettes. So the research question that we're trying to dig into today is, are e-cigarettes and NRTs substitutes or complements? So it makes sense that they'd be related, because if they're both can be useful as smoking cessation aids, then you might expect some sort of relationship between them, or it's certainly at least theoretically plausible. So when we talk about substitutes and complements, we're talking about, well, if the price of one good goes up, if they're substitutes, consumption of the second good goes up, because the first consumption of the first good goes down, so the consumption of the second good goes up. They're substitutes. Complements would be if the price of the first good goes up, then use of the second good goes down. So the first good going down because they're complementary, because of the complementarity, leads to the second one going down. So we're going to examine this question in the context of e-cigarette taxes. So specifically, what we're trying to answer, what's the causal effect of e-cigarette taxes on NRTs, as being our kind of main research question. And then we have a couple other questions that I'll get to. So between 2010 and 2021, 31 states passed legislation requiring a tax on e-cigarettes. There are also some localities. So, in large part, these taxes are motivated by a desire to keep youth from initiating use of e-cigarettes. But at the same time, there's concern that these taxes may impede harm reduction efforts, meaning, switching to a still harmful but much less harmful nicotine-containing product than conventional cigarettes. So to understand the full effect on harm reduction, we need to know whether they influence, these taxes influence the use of other harm reduction products. So in other words, if e-cigarette taxes cause some cigarette smokers to not attempt to quit via e-cigarettes, well, that indicates a reduction in harm reduction. And so then what are they doing instead? Are we assuming that the counterfactual is just that they're always continuing to smoke in that case? Or are they potentially switching, instead of using e-cigarettes to help quit, because e-cigarettes are now relatively more expensive, are they using NRTs to help quit instead? So the detrimental effect on harm reduction would be lesser if, so a less negative, kind of side effect, if some of these people who otherwise would be using e-cigarettes as a cessation tool are using NRTs. And so that's really what we're trying to examine here. And, set it up as they could theoretically be substitutes or complements. Probably the stronger, the least theoretical case would be that they'd be substitutes. And there's really two different channels through which we'd end up concluding that they're substitutes. So consider what would happen to, when e-cigarette taxes go up or are introduced, to number one, people who already were vapors. And then number two, to people who started off as smokers, but not vapors. So for people who already vape, maybe some of them, the tax makes them try to stop. And maybe some of them who decide that they want to stop vaping because of the cost might utilize NRTs kind of off-label to do so. So in that case, e-cigarette taxes would lead to vaping going down and NRT use going up. Now, consider then those people who start off as smokers. So smokers who are trying to quit. Well, they might, they're considering, do I use e-cigarettes to aid my quit attempt, or do I use NRTs? If e-cigarette taxes make the former relatively more expensive, so on the margin, smokers who are trying to quit and looking for an aid would then be more likely to use NRTs rather than e-cigarettes. And again, you end up empirically at the same place, right? In terms of the e-cigarette taxes would lead to a reduction in vaping, but then an increase in NRT use. So in both those scenarios, e-cigarettes and NRTs, we'd end up finding were substitutes. In theory, they could also be complements, say if there's complementarities, if the use of one makes the other one more effective and so on. So it's possible it could go either direction. So just briefly, not going to spend a lot of time on the literature, but the kind of strand of the literature that most directly relates to our work is this literature on the effects of e-cigarette taxes. And a lot of that work has focused on what's the effect of e-cigarette taxes on use of both e-cigarettes and combustible cigarettes. With really a good bit of evidence by now suggesting that e-cigarettes and traditional cigarettes are economic substitutes. So that leads to some interesting, policy debates that in theory anyway, to the extent that e-cigarettes and cigarettes are substitutes, if you really crack down on e-cigarettes, like through taxes, well, you're hoping that just leads people to not use nicotine. But if a large enough segment of those people actually just switch to more dangerous, more harmful cigarette smoking, then potentially the public health impact could actually be negative. So the extent of this substitutability is between e-cigarettes and cigarettes is really important for kind of welfare considerations. And so there's a bunch of these studies now, just to highlight one, sort of representative finding. This is from Pesco et al. 2020. A $1 increase in the e-cigarette tax per fluid milliliter of nicotine reduces vaping, the likelihood of being a vapor by 0.5 percentage points, which comes to 15%, and increases daily smoking by 0.6 percentage points, or 5%. So 15% reduction in vaping, but a 5% increase in smoking. Okay, now there's one study by Catherine McLean et al. That does look at some of these cessation medications, but focuses on prescription cessation medications. It finds that e-cigarette taxes are not statistically related to them. So that's probably the closest study to our work here. But rather than looking primarily at prescription NRTs, we're going to be looking at over-the-counter NRTs. And in theory, you might expect a tighter relationship between over-the-counter NRTs and e-cigarettes than between prescription NRTs and e-cigarettes, just because e-cigarettes themselves are not prescription medications. So essentially, they're quote unquote over-the-counter, different kind of counter, but they're they're able to be just bought without a doctor's approval, as is the case with over-the-counter NRTs. So you might expect it's possible that e-cigarettes and prescription NRTs are not substitutes, but that e-cigarettes and over-the-counter NRTs might be. So that's kind of really the primary research question that we're examining here. Now, as kind of secondary evidence on just how smoking cessation efforts in general are impacted, we're also going to examine effects on quitline calls and Medicaid finance prescriptions for non-nicotine smoking cessation medications. So those that don't contain nicotine. So that's another kind of new hook relative to the McLean et al. Paper. And bottom line, just preview of results, we're not going to find any clear evidence of effects really on any of these outcomes. We're going to have a lot of null results, and they're going to be reasonably precisely estimated, and the effect sizes are going to be quite small. So largely, this is going to end up being kind of a null results story, with a little bit of evidence possibly suggesting a temporary increase in NRT use right at the time taxes go up, that then goes away. And we're gonna and we'll drill down and kind of debate that a little more as we go along. Okay, so to introduce our main data set, Nielsen Retail Sales Database from 2010 to 2020. So there's a bit of a sampling issue across this time span. Used to be 30,000 to 36,000 stores. Since 2018, there've been about 49,000 stores. So what we do is we just create a balance panel. We're only going to include stores that appear in every quarter of the data. And also we're only going to include stores that sell at least one NRT product in each quarter. Okay, the Nielsen data has pretty good coverage, but it's not like it's a little disproportionate. So it hits 50% of drugstore sales, quite a bit, 15 to 26% of food store, mass merchandise, or dollar store and club store sales, but only 2% of convenience store and liquor store sales. So we just have to, kind of keep that in mind, as that this is the sample that we're utilizing, that we can kind of best utilize, and that's just the composition. So we analyze data at the store by quarter level. So essentially a little bit of aggregation to get it to store by quarter. So that's our unit of observation. And our outcomes out of the Nielsen data are going to be e-cigarette sales in fluid milliliters of nicotine sold, count of total NRTs sold, and then count by NRT type, gum, lozenges, patches, so kind of disaggregating. Then, as I alluded to, some secondary outcomes. Medicaid financed non-nicotine cessation medications, those come from the state drug utilization database. Calls to state quitlines come from the CDC. So here's a little map just showing, and this is happening at different times. Minnesota was the early part of our sample. But this just is a map of, green has adopted an e-cigarette tax, by the end of our sample period, and white had not. So we see, a little bit of a geographic pattern, but not really like an overwhelming geographic pattern. There's scattered green really throughout most of the country. Then a lot of green up in the Northeast and the Mid-Atlantic. But at least it's not, an overwhelmingly clear. In other words, there could be some as good as random happening that we can exploit. And I should add also, it's not indicated on the map, but Cook County, in other words, Chicago, in Illinois, and Montgomery County, major suburban county in the DC area, in Maryland, also have their own taxes. Okay, so the data, there's 3 types of e-cigarette taxes. And we have to basically find a way to kind of unify them and consolidate them into one tax variable. So this is a unit tax per milliliter of liquid volume. And there's an ad valorem tax as a percent of the wholesale price. And there's a sales tax as a percent of the pre-tax retail price. So there's 3 different types. We're using data from Cotti et al. 2021 that had standardized, that had developed a standardized tax measure to make these apples to apples. It ends up in dollars per milliliters of fluid nicotine. And the demand for, and reason for measuring it this way is because the demand for tobacco products is derived from the demand for nicotine. Now, the strongest assumption we have to make in this standardization is we have to assume a 35% retailer markup over wholesale. That's based on, a bunch of different sources of information that suggest that that's about right for the industry. We've done sensitivity analyses varying, that markup, and, it doesn't tend to meaningfully impact the results. But that's kind of the biggest assumptions we got to get. The, ad valorem is as a percent of wholesale, and that we got to kind of translate that into retail. So that's our main kind of policy measure. We're gonna control in some specifications. There's sort of ongoing debate about controls in diff and event study models. So we're kind of just going to do it different ways. So state level covariance that we include in some models, county level tobacco 21 laws. I mean, basically all the policies that relate to vaping and smoking. And then we also have cigar and little cigar taxes. We're also controlling for the ACA's Medicaid expansion, whether, that could influence, utilization of prescription services, right, which would be substitutes for these products. We're going to control for whether Medicaid covers different types of NRT products. Going to control for laws that legalize marijuana for medical and recreational use, since there could be some substitutability or complementarity there. And also control for demographics, specifically age, gender, and education. So the methods, so our base model is essentially your usual 2-way fixed effects. So we are regressing quarterly store sales. So C being sales in store I, so the subscripts in sales in store I, in tax jurisdiction J, in quarter year T. So question, what's tax jurisdiction? Well, that's our geographic unit. Tax jurisdiction is basically state, but because Cook County and Montgomery County have their own taxes, we kind of pull them out from the rest of the state. So essentially, we have like the state of Cook County and then the rest of the state of Illinois, and they're separate. So, that's why tax jurisdiction is not exactly equivalent to state, but it is pretty close to being equivalent to state. And quarter year is just our time. So that means, the time is measured in kind of quarters since the start of the sample period. Okay, so the e-tax being the e-cigarette tax variable, then XJT are those other policies and demographics that are at the, quote, tax jurisdiction, again, mostly state level. And then we're going to have store fixed effects and time fixed effects as well. And then you see our error term. Standard errors are going to be, as is typically done in the sort of program evaluation work, we're going to be clustering at the level of the policy, which is tax jurisdiction in this case. And in most of our models, we're just presenting unweighted analyses. So each store is sort of allowed to count the same. We do have a robustness check that uses weights that, allow essentially larger stores to have a bigger weight, but the main analyses are unweighted. And Justin, I think this was where we were gonna pause and just see if there were questions.
Yeah, that's great. I would say to the audience, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A and we'll try to get to them. And so we can now turn to the discussant, Cessation, to see if she has any questions for you.
Thank you. Thank you, Chuck. Very interesting study. I think at this point, I only have some clarification question.
Okay.
I know you showed the Nielsen data coverage, but are you aware of any information that shows how well Nielsen data would capture an NRT marketplace? Like, does it cover, let's say, 70%? I'm just throwing out a number. This is because we all know that it doesn't cover e-cigarettes marketplace that well because it doesn't capture the vape shop sales. So I'm wondering if there is any evidence showing that Nielsen data is good enough to capture the marketplace of over-the-counter NRTs.
That's an excellent question. I'm not going to have a number off the top of my head. I don't know if Mike or Catherine do. I will say I would expect that number, but it's a good number that we should get. We should know that. I will say that it should be better than e-cigarettes because you're not, going to vape shops to get your NRTs. So 50% coverage of drugstores should be, pretty helpful, I would think. So I expect it to be less of an issue than with e-cigarettes just because of the nature of the coverage, but I don't have a number off the top of my head.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I guess my other questions are related to the modeling itself, including the controls and the outcome variables. I know that in one slide you show a very comprehensive list of control variables, but I think there are several possible controls that you guys might want to consider. One is cigarette taxes, because I see the little cigar taxes there, but I don't think I saw cigarette taxes there. Given that this is cigarette taxes are shown to increase quitting attempt, so I think that.
I think I might have just forgot to. I might have just.
Yeah, that's my guess.
Made a mistake and not put it on the slide. I'm pretty sure we've got that in there.
Yeah, and another one is the state spending on supporting cessation programs.
Okay, that's a good idea. That's a good idea. Yeah.
Yeah, so just some sensitivity test.
Yeah.
And then another just a quick thought about this is the people who want to quit still need to pay NRT in other occasions when they purchase, right? So I'm wondering if there is a way to control for the cost that they pay to get NRT. I know price is an endogenous variable, but just wondering if there is any good way to control for the cost, because you're looking at e-cigarette tax, but the cost of NRT itself is not in the model.
Right. Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, sorry, were you still?
Oh yeah, no, just some thoughts. I know like just try to improve the modeling a little bit, but it may create endogeneity problem, which I realize. One last question before we turn this to audience question. So I feel that the outcome variable is the sales of all three different over-the-counter NRT products. So how comfortable are you to aggregate all this three different NRTs just by the unit sales, or are there some considerations to separate them out as like individual products?
Yeah, all great questions. So for that question, we are going to separate them out in some of the models, but we should do event studies as well. We should do the whole battery of checks also for each of those three separate categories, and we haven't done that yet. So that's something we need to do. Your question about controlling for the cost of NRT is really interesting. It's possible, of course, in Nielsen data to construct a price like a state by time price measure. It would be possible to do that. As you said, we'd worry about endogeneity. That could be something though that's worth just trying as like a robustness test, and making sure that just doesn't affect anything. And my other thought is store fixed effects and year fixed effects are going to capture a good chunk of the variation in price, right? They would capture the time trend and also whatever the store type effect might be, or a geographic fixed effect, but not all of it. So yeah, so I think it's a good idea to consider controlling for price, because there's not really like a tax variable we can, include for that. So yeah, thanks. Those are terrific comments.
Thank you. I don't think I have further questions. I had some question about the tax jurisdiction, but you already explained that. So I think I'll stop there. Thank you.
Right.
So there are no audience questions at the moment. Catherine's answered a couple. I would throw out, here's one that just came in. I'll hold mine then. This is from Elizabeth Quinn. Why is your outcome variable at the store level? Why not aggregated to the tax jurisdiction quarter level?
Yeah, so it could be done that way. It's econometrically, there's not sort of obvious reasons that it should matter. I mean, we've done the tax jurisdiction by quarter level. We tried it. I believe, if my memory is correct, that and Catherine is typing, she may type something much better than what I'm saying, but that the standard errors were, that we, because ultimately we're going to have kind of a null result story. So if you have a null result story, you really want those confidence intervals to be tight. You don't just want big wide confidence intervals where you can't reject 0 and you also can't reject a very big effect size. So there's an effort to try to have as efficient a model as possible, and by leaving the data at the store level and then including store fixed effects, we just were able to get more precise estimates despite clustering at the tax jurisdiction level. So I think that was kind of an efficiency consideration, if memory serves correct.
Great. So one question I would ask is, so vapors on average tend to be younger than cigarette smokers, I think. And so I'm assuming, but don't know this for a fact, that they're probably vapors are less addicted, generally speaking. And so maybe less likely to rely on nicotine replacement products than cigarette smokers to quit. And so I'm curious about sort of how that you don't look at cessation per se, and you focus in your lit review sort of on where the literature has been mostly focused on sort of the substitution between cigarettes and e-cigarettes. And I'm curious about what your response would be about sort of how you think about cessation without use of nicotine replacement products, especially because you sort of foreshadowing that you said there's no results that you end up finding.
Well, certainly your point would be something that would explain, that would explain a null result, right? I mean, if as I indicated there, you can envision effects among people who are initially vapors, right? That maybe they're trying to go from vaping to nothing and thinking of NRTs as a step down. And your point being that, well, if the vapors are kind of younger, they're generally less addicted. Maybe they don't need that, and so maybe that channel isn't going to be that active, and so that would certainly point to a null result, which would be consistent ultimately with what we're finding. Then there would be that other channel where people who are smokers who are trying to quit smoking would be kind of deciding between the two different quote harm reduction methods, and then the tax on e-cigarettes could tilt them one way, and so that mechanism might still be alive. But yeah, certainly your point's a good one, and it would point us in the direction of nulls, which is what we're finding. And there's probably more descriptive information we could get on that in terms of, well, do vapors actually, do people actually switch from e-cigarettes to NRTs just in general? How frequent is that? There's probably descriptive information out there that we could and should utilize.
Yeah. Okay, well, I don't see any other questions at the moment, so why don't you carry on and show us what you found.
All right, sounds good. And feel free to kind of, if questions start coming in, feel free to interrupt or however works best. So yeah, so now just kind of getting into the results. So first, we're just showing effective e-cigarette taxes on e-cigarette sales per store by quarter. So this is essentially, is there a first stage, right? If there's no, if e-cigarette taxes don't even affect e-cigarette sales, if there's no own price elasticity, then there's not going to be much, there shouldn't be really much cross price elasticity, right? So just establishing that there is in fact a first stage. So this is, it's not an exact replication. It's a near replication of some existing work that's used Nielsen to look at kind of own price elasticities based on taxes. And so we're finding a $1 increase in the e-cigarette tax, reducing e-cigarette sales by 87.6. And again, that's in that milliliter unit. And so how big is that? So 87, it's on a base of 242. So that's a sizable, amount relative to 242. Well, how big is a $1 tax? Well, a $1 tax ends up being off a base price of $5 something. So you can think of a $1 increase in an e-cigarette tax as being like a 20% price increase. So 20% price increase leading to, a pretty substantial effect size. Basically, if you work out the numbers, these numbers equate to about an own price elasticity of roughly 2. So, which is quite elastic. So indicating e-cigarettes are quite elastic, and that figure of 2 is around what we found in our prior JHE paper that used these data. So that seems to kind of check out, kind of have face validity. So then just looking at, and this is with all stores in here, is there an effect of the e-cigarette tax on just stores selling at NRTs, period? And pretty clearly there's not. That's a pretty precise 0. So with that, we then move on and then use our sample restriction where we're restricting to stores that sold at least 1 NRT in each quarter in the data. Okay. And so here's really our slide of kind of main results here. So let's work left to right. The different columns just refer to different, the first model in column 1 is pretty streamlined. It's just got our tax measure and then period and store fixed effects, none of the other controls. And then we add in the tobacco control policies, and we see that actually flips the sign to positive. Remember, a positive sign indicates substitution, a negative sign would indicate complementarity. So just adding those tobacco control policies flips us to substitution, although it's nowhere near statistically significant. Here's our confidence interval. Then adding other policies, the not tobacco policies, things like marijuana, ACA, Medicaid expansion, trims the effect size a little. Again, still nowhere near statistically significant. Adding in the demographic controls trims it a little bit more, and again, nowhere near statistically significant. And this final column, I won't get bogged down here, but DCDH. So there's now, this in the last, handful of years, this realization that staggered treatment time to a fixed effects models can have issues with bias if treatment effects are heterogeneous. And so there's that literature, Goodman, Bacon, and others. So DCDH is, and you see in the table notes, De Chase Martin and De Halt. I'm not even going to try it. De Halt Foil. But so DCDH is their method, and that is a method that is sort of robust to these concerns about bias from heterogeneous treatment effects. So it's just one of these newer models that kind of purges that bias. And the reason for kind of preferring DCDH over some other alternatives, at least at this point in time, is you don't have to just have a binary treatment variable. You can have a series of discrete, your treatment variable can have a series of discrete values with DCDH. So we kind of recast e-cigarette tax to 50-cent increments. And so we'll look at it like a series of discrete values. Well, long story short, this is just trying to make sure that this issue from bias of heterogeneous treatment effects and staggered diff and diff style models isn't what's driving our kind of nulls. And it's not. In fact, it gets even sort of closer. It gets even closer to zero with the DCDH approach. Now, I will point out that this tends to be a less efficient approach, so the confidence interval grows wider. All right, so let's try to wrestle just for a second with this question of are these precise zeros? Are these sort of true zeros, or is it just sort of an imprecise mess? So like, can we, what can we rule out? What can't we rule out? So if we look at kind of our most heavily controlled model, that point estimate there, if you kind of, and here's the average NRT sales pre. So 154, over 14,000, a tick over 1%. So if this 154 was a real, true, statistically significant effect, it would be pretty small, right around 1%. Okay. Well, what can we rule out? Well, here's the tip of the confidence interval. That's roughly, a little more than tripling. So it's in the threes, 3 and some change percent. So basically, our best guess is a 1% effect size. And again, it's not statistically significant. And we can rule out effects of larger than 3%-ish relative to the mean. So, we would argue that those are pretty precise zeros, so that we're ruling out, sizable effects, even though you can't conclude conclusively that it's a true zero, but we feel like we can rule out, large effect sizes or meaningfully large effect sizes. Okay. So now this is where we drill down to some different subcategories: gum, lozenge, and patch, the 3 types, and then just brand versus generic. And, we continue to have a lot of nothing, basically. 90, the confidence interval here, 0 is well inside the confidence interval of in all 5 cases. We have about, and again, we continue to have effect sizes around 1%-ish. So, it doesn't seem like heterogeneity across types is masking anything. So here now we're going to turn to Medicaid finance prescriptions for non-nicotine cessation medications. So this is just one of our other outcomes, one of our other data sources. And again, not really, we're seeing pretty, seeing confidence intervals that 0 is well inside of, so no evidence of effects. Now, we're not, the average, you see the average is 564, 628, 418. So the estimated effect sizes are a good bit bigger than the 1% we saw before. So we're not quite as precise in terms of what we can rule out, but we can't rule in anything. And then here's calls to state quitlines. E-cigarette taxes are, actually associated with fewer calls to state quitlines for help. So, by that measure, fewer smoking cessation efforts, but again, highly insignificant, and roughly 10% relative to the mean. So again, not super precisely estimated. All right, here's where it gets a little bit more interesting. Here's our event study. And we're doing the event study 2 different ways: catch-all endpoint. So I don't want to get too into the weeds there, but catch-all endpoints basically just means anything beyond 8 periods pre gets lumped together into this -8. Anything more than 8 periods post gets lumped together with this +8. Whereas trimmed endpoints just gets rid of periods outside of that window. But the figures look pretty similar regardless. So what we see, very nice pre-trends in both cases. We see in both cases what looks like a little bit of evidence of a jump up right in that first post-treatment period. So right as the tax is taking effect. And then that effect kind of decays and basically goes away. And this is 8 quarters, so it's 2 years. So is there some sort of immediate effect that then goes away, perhaps consistent with, switching to NRTs, then the NRT is successful, so you don't need it anymore, that kind of thing. This is you really, with the preponderance of evidence is pointing to nulls here. But this is sort of something we need to drill down and just try to examine a little bit more and just see if there might be anything there. At most, it seems to be a very quick temporary effect. But that's just sort of an interesting note and something that deserves a little more exploration. But with that said, when we do the DCDH flavor of the event study, that pattern disappears. So not really much of anything in the DCDH event study. Now, it's less precise, again, wider confidence intervals. But if you think that DCDH is superior in terms of it addresses one possible source of bias, then even that temporary effect isn't there anymore. So again, by and large, we're not really comfortable concluding, much of anything beyond it doesn't look like there's a lot going on. Just event study for the prescription non-nicotine medications. Good pre-trends, no clear evidence of anything in the post period. And then this is the Quitlines and similar story, not really anything of note going on there. So we do a bunch of different robustness checks. I'm not showing all of these results, but by and large, the sort of conclusion holds up. Various different sample inclusion criteria. Try dropping the period after the law passed, but before it was implemented. Try adding a linear tax jurisdiction specific time trend. So in the spirit of the state specific time trends, try adding census division by time fixed effects, just kind of all the standard stuff, controlling for distance to the nearest, place that doesn't have an e-cigarette tax. So to address like this cross-border shopping issue, weighting, using tax jurisdiction rather than store fixed effects, doing the leave out one treated unit at a time. So we've tried all of those sorts of things. So finally, I can wrap up. And again, just the punchline in our main regressions, we find no statistically significant evidence that e-cigarette taxes affect total over-the-counter NRT sales, any category, or these other cessation-related measures we looked at. For NRT sales, we have point estimates that are small and confidence intervals that are pretty narrow, as I said before. And then we've got this little, sort of curious result in the event study regressions that needs further investigation, but it clearly isn't a robust result at the moment. And then so to end on a little bit of a question, would the paper benefit from supplementing what we have with some survey data? The behavioral risk factor surveillance system would be a nice big data set that has info on vaping, smoking, and cessation attempts, for instance. So that's a bit of a question to kind of leave hanging. Would, how much value would that add? So with that, I'll wrap up, and thank you all for coming and for listening.
Thanks so much for this presentation. This is great. I'm going to turn it over again to Cessation for any discussant comments or questions.
Yeah, thank you, Chuck. Fascinating results. So I have some thoughts about the results. So first of all, in terms of considering or be hypothesizing that NRTs and e-cigarettes are substitutes, do we have any evidence when the e-cigarettes started to take off and we see decreases in the sales of NRTs? Because that's something Nielsen data could potentially help better hypothesize how we see the relationship between the two products. That's one thought. Another one being that we know the e-cigarette market evolves very quickly. So in 2017, Juul started to take off. And I've seen many research coming out of tobacco regulatory science showing that the salt products are better substitutes compared to just free-based nicotine that has very low concentration and can't deliver nicotine as efficient as Juul type of device. So I'm just wondering if you change your study period to maybe 2017 or later, would you see a different results? Because what you capture is, most of the data points would come from the 2010 to 16, when it's mostly free-based nicotine, whereas 2017 to afterwards, it might be mostly salt products. Yeah, I need to double check whether 2017 was the year, but that's in my memory. So I think that could give you some confidence on whether, the non-results is because of the product's design of e-cigarettes, as the capacity of them being a substitute for cigarettes or for NRTs. So that's my thoughts. So some additional check analysis to do. So if you want to respond, feel free. I have one last question. So do you have any?
No, those are great comments. We did have trends in these we do have a figure in the sort of draft of the paper that shows trends in the products over time, and I'm trying to bring it out. I remember what it looked like. I mean, it wasn't necessarily like, it was up and down in terms of NRT sales. It wasn't like a clear one way or the other trend. Your second point about the doing a robustness check, trying 2017 or later. Yeah, great point. Definitely something we should do.
Yeah, I guess my last question is about, we talk about relationship between products, I feel as an economist, I'm an economist too. Usually I'm thinking about the economic relationship.
Yeah.
So, but in this NRT cases, especially the Medicaid financed the therapies or cessation treatments, in my opinion, I'm just curious, like how people see those products as goods. So let's say if they don't have to pay out of pocket, are we expecting them to respond to any like pricing of another product if it's like mostly covered?
Yeah.
I was thinking, from the economic relationship perspective, whether the null effect is what we should expect, rather than seeing them to respond to like prices of other potential substitutes.
Yeah. My instinct would definitely be that they're less clear of a substitute. I mean, we still thought it was worthy of checking, but yeah, I think that makes sense. And it's an interesting, if you're Medicaid, and your cost essentially is your time, right? You going to the doctor and then you get, prescription so it's not a monetary, it's essentially trading a time cost for a monetary cost, on the one hand, like that the one product you can get more easily, but you have to pay for, versus one that has a little bit, takes a little longer to get, but you don't have to pay for. So it's an interesting trade-off to think about. But I agree with you though. I think it's less clear as it's a less clear theoretically as a substitute for sure.
Yeah, thank you. I think I don't have additional questions. Thank you.
That was great. Thanks so much for the terrific points.
Thank you.
So we just have at this point one question in the chat that it has been unanswered, and this is from Nigar Nargis saying, can we interpret the finding about the lack of substitution of e-cigarettes in NRTs that e-cigarettes are mostly used for recreational use rather than therapeutic use or smoking cessation?
I don't think I'd be comfortable making that claim, but it's a heck of a question. I don't think I'd be comfortable making that claim just with these data alone. I think I'd probably need a wider array of evidence before being comfortable making that claim. It's a good point though. It's a good, I'd have to think a little bit harder about that. I definitely don't want to go on record saying something like that kind of offhand. I do think there's good evidence that they're used for both purposes, and
I think it could be something about the types of people who tend to use one product versus the other.
Sure.
Could be different as well, and that could mitigate the substitution across products as well.
It's a little hard to picture, a 19-year-old like getting, putting a patch on, right, that kind of thing. So definitely different groups of people.
So there's one more from Ken Warner. Use of e-cigs is much more substantial among young adults, many of whom are not smokers, than among middle-aged and older adults. Wouldn't this alone seriously limit a substitution effect? I think this is the point we had that was made earlier. Young adult non-smoking vapors aren't going to switch to NRT, and non-vaping older adult smokers aren't going to be affected by an e-cig tax.
Seems consistent with our results at the moment. Yeah, it's a good point.
Okay, well, I think that those are all the questions. So maybe thank you very much for presenting. We'll now turn it to our MC, Yingming Wang, to take us out.
Thanks, Justin.
So we are out of time. Thank you to our presenter, moderator, and discussant. Finally, thank you to the audience of the 143 people for your participation. Have a top-notch weekend.
All right.